Behold, my glorious supporter EyePatchNotes wants me to discuss frame-specific arcanes. Now that the arcane landscape has been sort of overturned and updated, and other arcanes are not attached to cosmetic items anymore, we still have some arcanes that are. They're the old arcane helmets, which you can still equip, but they take up an arcane slot. And it'd be interesting if they decoupled those, or didn't, and added more. Would that be good? Would that be bad? This is kind of a complicated one to discuss logistically. I think that from like a gameplay perspective, I as a player think that sounds fun. I think a few more arcane helmets is not a bad thing. I like having frame-specific choices, but then also general choices that kind of weigh with each other. I think we do want to differentiate them from augments, and before I do that, I also want to talk a little bit about what exactly this is, what are we instituting here, and the form that I would like to see it in. So a long time ago, arcanes, which are basically enchantments in Warframe, were coupled to cosmetics. So you'd have your Warframe, and you'd have their cape, and you would enchant their cape with an effect that gave you some effect, but then it was only on that cape, and you couldn't use it for everyone, and you'd either have to get a bunch of them or keep taking it off and putting it on something different, which was annoying, so they stopped doing that. But there is still one version of an arcane, an enchantment effect, that is tied to a cosmetic, and they're Warframe helmets. So for a specific Warframe, if you have a specific helmet, you can get a small specific effect. I'll give you an example of one I have, one of the ones that's actually useful still. Loki has one where you can equip a certain helmet. It's the Swindle helmet. And if you have the arcane version of the Swindle helmet, which you can only get by buying it from other players because they're discontinued, they haven't existed for years, they haven't dropped for like 5 years, but you can buy them from other players. And if you equip this helmet, you get 15% ability range. I think it's 15%. And also like a tiny meaningless negative that we're not even going to talk about. Probably like max health or something. And it also takes up one of your arcane slots. So basically, it's an arcane that is specific to Loki that's also a little different from other arcanes. It's not an effect that you activate based on a chance. It's more like another mod slot that is kind of weak that you trade for an arcane slot, but only on Loki or whatever frame, you know? Kind of a complicated thing. And the first thing you're going to think if you play modern Warframe and you didn't know what these are until just now is, wow, that sounds really messy. And I agree. I think that if this was going to be a thing that would continue, I think what they need to do is decouple the arcane from the arcane helmet and finally complete they've been continuing to do this. They said they're going to do this with landing crafts. Landing crafts have abilities. They're going to take the ability off the landing craft so you can pick whatever cosmetic landing craft you want and whatever ability you want. That's the right way to do it. This is a game where you want things to look cool. You don't want to make a gameplay decision based on how it looks. You want to get to choose whatever you want. This game is all about customization. I don't know why that wasn't the case before, but anyway, awesome, good. They should keep doing that. And they should do it with arcane helmets too. I don't want them to add more helmets where I have to equip a specific cosmetic to get a specific gameplay effect, because I, as somebody who makes builds, I want my build to be just so. I don't want to have to worry about, I want the fashion to look good too. I don't have to have to build around a cosmetic helmet that I often don't like. Saren has a couple of arcane helmets that I think are ugly, but they are technically good for racing. They make you faster for drift frame. So anyway, so if they were to put these in, I think you're right that it's an interesting Nightwave offering, but I think I would like them as their own standalone arcane. Now, they basically already are their own standalone arcane. That wouldn't weaken or strengthen the effect. It would just mean that your fashion wouldn't be tied to it. So, provided they're their own standalone arcane, now we're going to discuss a little bit what the implications of we're making arcanes for one specific frame. And they work a little differently too. They tend not to be arcane-like effects where you need to trigger them and then they give you something on a chance. They tend to be more like a mod. It's much more similar to the effect of a mod, but you need to, sacrifice some tiny amount of stuff. So first of all, let's get rid of all the negatives. There's already a negative because you have to sacrifice an arcane slot. That's already a negative. I think Warframe broadly mostly shouldn't have negatives because you're already sacrificing something by using up a slot. Things like corrupted mods make sense because for them to, you have strength and then you have blind rage, which is more strength, but you get negative efficiency. That's good because it kind of does take up multiple mod slots. Like you're probably going to offset that efficiency or address that in some way. So those are fine. But for Arcanes, it doesn't make any sense. Now that they take up an Arcane slot, they used not to. Now you are sacrificing another Arcane, so there's no reason for them to have negatives, and all the negatives were comically small anyway, so just get rid of all the negatives. Just no more negatives on Arcane Helmet effects. We're going to start calling them frame-specific Arcanes now, so no negatives, get rid of that stuff. I think they should be minor, and I think the other thing we need to do is differentiate them from augments, Warframe augments. We already have a type of game piece which modifies a thing on the loadout screen that is specific to a frame, and they're Warframe augments. Augments, they modify specific abilities. These are a little different because they don't modify specific abilities, they give you specific qualities. But it would be pretty easy to imagine a world where a lot of Arcane helmets would feel kind of like augments that are just an Arcane. I think that's kind of boring. What I mean by this is that, for example, for Loki with his Swindle helmet, that gives him range. Loki's interested in range. He can teleport further. His Radial Disarm, his sort of ace ability that takes away enemies' guns, that ability has good range. You want it to have long range. And so range can be viewed as kind of an augment for Radial Disarm, if that makes sense. So even though they are general stats, it's sort of like it may not be that interesting from a modding perspective to say, but this practically basically just affects this one ability. Do you want that or not? That's the same thinking as an augment. I think the ones that exist can stay, whatever. It's not a big deal. There aren't very many of them that are relevant anyway. You could buff them. I think the way to make them more interesting is to change the effects so that when you're getting one of these frame-specific Arcanes, it gives you something that doesn't directly relate to the frame's kit, but it might have some kind of tangential relation. I think that this is the place that Digital Extremes could start looking at community builds and responding to them. I think it'd be interesting to have, let me give you an example. So, to think of a good example, it's not the easiest thing. Volt, for example. Let's do it kind of a simple one. Volt has various builds you might want to use. Some of them are based on augments, like Capacitance is a category of build. Some of them are not, at least not reliant on augments, like Riot Shield Volt or Speed Volt. They can benefit from augments, but they don't rely on them. Capacitance is this build where you stack a bunch of overshields, and the playstyle is based on what you're going to do with those overshields, and you have this powerful CC, and it wipes the whole map of enemies if they're very dense. It does lots of damage if enemies are tightly packed. It'd be kind of interesting to give Volt a frame-specific Arcane that was something like this. It gives him like 50% more overshield capacity. Almost all of the time, that doesn't particularly matter to Volt. It's not bad, and it's the kind of thing that on most frames it wouldn't be bad, but it isn't immediately really good. It's not like you would be always equipping it. You would only really think of it if it was like, oh, I'm using Capacitance. Now I can store up more overshields while using Capacitance, which I may or may not want. I might be using Capacitance in a way where that doesn't really matter, where I'm sustaining the amount of shields I get. For example, the way I use Capacitance is I'll hit enemies with it, and then I use them as like a shield battery, and then I'll go fight other enemies, knowing that my shields will be regenerating and I'm going to be fine. But you could use Capacitance to just do tons of damage, and then it's probably better to bank a bunch of overshields and then rely on them until you cast Capacitance again. This new frame-specific Arcane for Volt would be really good for that, because it would let you hold more overshields. The overshield cap is a static 1200, and it doesn't change with your shield capacity. Having more shields, like redirection, doesn't make you able to have more overshields on top of those shields. There are a few things that do, like, for example, there's passives that do, but generally it's static. And so this would be a way to increase that. And again, at first, it would seem like I get how Volt could get overshields, but I don't immediately think, oh, this is just an automatic include in that one build. Maybe people would think that, I don't know. But do you see how the example I'm trying to make is that it sort of augments a thing that is generally applicable to Warframes, but specifically for Volt, it's an interesting choice in a way that it wouldn't be an interesting choice for other Warframes. So for example, there are other frames that don't have any way to generate overshields, and it's like, who cares about having more overshield capacity? There are yet other frames that do generate overshields, and they basically always care about overshield capacity, so it also wouldn't be an interesting choice for those frames. For example, I can't really think of a Harrow build where you wouldn't even care about overshield capacity. You might still decide not to use it, of course, but it's basically always valuable. I don't know why you're using a Harrow build that doesn't use his 1 or his 2, and his 2, you get longer duration if you use more shields. Storing up more overshields is good. His passive already stores up more. There are a few other frames like that where you basically would always want more overshield capacity, or you basically would never want more overshield capacity. But looking at community builds, like the ones that I'm trying to make soon, for a frame like Volt, you'd think, oh, well, even the Volt builds that makes overshields, you wouldn't always want this thing. So it could be an interesting new choice to allow people to express more within that niche. The reason I say this is because one of the things that I dislike about Warframe's buildcraft is that for all its complexity, once you have an archetype, there's often kind of just like not a right answer, but you can sort of calculate out how much do you need to like make it work, and then if it's just your preference to get more of that thing, then fine, but it kind of just works. And you can often sort of get to the point where there isn't really a reason to edit the build any further. I feel that way about, there's an Equinox build that is Maim and Duality and Sleep Equinox, and it's pretty tight, it's really good, but it's not interesting at all. It's just like you can fit those things together. There are really no compelling choices to make, it just works. And that's fine, it's not like every build is like that, but it would be cool if there were more little things where you could express yourself about that build, where when I give you a build, I'm often trying to teach you, you can think about it this way and then extrapolate from there. But much of the time, I make a compelling enough argument that it should just be like this, and there aren't really other, at least to me, I often show people builds and I think, yeah, I mean, you could choose things differently, but I don't see why you would. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense. You shouldn't, but you could, And then there are builds where I don't feel that way, of course. But what I'm getting at is that it would be cool if there were little preference things like that. Like you could maybe want the Overshield Arcane or not, or go for an approach where you don't like using the capacitance build to bank Overshields or not. You could express it that way a little bit. And then there become sort of more variants of playstyles, which I think is a good thing. I think that would be cool. That's why I want them. Again, I think there's a risk that they become basically augments. I think there's a risk that there's just like a ton of them. I think there are enough game pieces in Warframe at the moment. A really interesting thing with Apex Legends at the moment, a battle royale game, is that, games like this are usually introducing new pieces all the time. There's a new gun every season or whatever. And Apex Legends recently in the patch notes, they were saying, we feel like we have the right number of guns. Like adding more would just make the loot pool more confusing, and that's not necessarily good. So we have to find a way to manage that. And they can't just get rid of guns and rotate in new ones because players have bought skins for them, of course. And again, I mean, Warframe, it's a very different game, but the point is that I think, for example, for Warframe mods, for power mods for Warframes, I feel like there are kind of enough. Like, we don't need more. Like, there's enough of a pool of them to do what you want to do, and there are certain trade-offs, right? So I feel that way about the Arcanes, too, where I wouldn't want them to just add dozens more Arcanes. Like, if there was an update where, even not frame-specific ones, they said, oh, we added all these new Arcanes, I would kind of push back a little bit. Like, why, It kind of feels like there's no... They could be good, like there could be some that are interesting, but adding more and more and more game elements isn't necessarily good, especially when we have so many that could be good but currently aren't, There's a lot of mods, for example. Not a lot of Arcanes, actually, but some Arcanes, and a lot of mods that the effect could be good if it was rebalanced, but it hasn't been. And what they're gonna do is add more mods instead of balancing those, and what they should do is balance those instead of adding new ones, I think. So this could be like that a little bit. I don't know, I think that it's nice to have these little things that maybe to explain it a different way. It's like if you really like this one frame, you can kind of get this ultra specific thing for that frame that it feels like nobody cares about except for you. I like that kind of thing, and I feel like because these types of Arcanes, the frame specific Arcanes, because they're so specific and they're so static, like it's just giving you more of some value, they should be pretty easy to implement too. Like it doesn't really have any programming consequences that I can think of anyway. You should be able to just say like this just increases their overshield value or what have you, a thing that is already coded into the game and you just get from this item. So they should be pretty simple, and then you can add in this sort of, again, ultra specific thing that a lot of people won't want, but the game is about customization. A lot of people will want if they really like that thing. The final reason that I wanted to come out strong for this idea is that I've been trying to think more and more and negotiate how I feel about people who say they main something. The problem with this mindset is that when you play something a lot, there's sort of a paradox of seniority where you playing the same thing all the time is viewed as meaning that you're an expert on the thing, but most of the time it actually means that your advice is worse than somebody who hasn't played it as much, because you've lost perspective on like what that thing means in context. Whereas if you haven't played the thing as much, or you've played the thing a moderate amount, those people often have better advice because they still remember not playing the thing, and they've maybe changed it more recently or whatever. Whereas the people that have said, like, I'm a Volt main and I like this, like that is not an endorsement of that thing that you're talking about. In fact, that almost makes it suspect whether the thing is good. That doesn't mean that you're a voice of authority on that thing. I would claim to be a decent voice of authority on a lot of things in Warframe because I don't focus on any specific one as much as possible anyway. And I do spend a lot of time listening to my community tell me I'm wrong or they disagree about things, or they think that an idea I had does make sense and here's why. We spend so much time discussing that. I think that is a good source of, basically someone's a good source of information based on how often they've been disputed and thought about that seriously, not how long they've done something for. Doing something for a long time makes you a worse source of information, not a better one most of the time. This is true of just every part of life, not just Warframe. But however, people think that way, People like to identify as this one thing, and I don't think that entire way of thinking should be resisted. I don't think it's like stupid or wrong to have a favorite thing. There is a part of me that is going to say something really harsh, that I do view favorites as a little bit immature. It feels to me like you can't have one favorite if you had the time to try other things or had bothered to try other things. And so it makes me think, if you say you like main a thing or whatever, that just means that you don't bother trying other things. You're just closed-minded. That doesn't mean anything about you being a specialist, but that's not entirely true. There are plenty of things where you simply can't do things with that specific selection unless you spend a lot of time with it. Good examples are like fighting games. You simply can't get good enough at certain techniques until you spend enough time doing it that you should probably say that you main the thing, like you spend a lot of time on it, And I'm also personally biased because I just don't like doing that, and so I like to keep an open mind to it. That's all I'm trying to say. And I feel like a good way to encourage people to enjoy the one thing that they found that they enjoy or whatever is to give them a little variety in enjoying it. And you can cater to people that have really focused in on one thing the same way you can cater to newer players or the average difficulty that the player base is experiencing or whatever. You can also cater to these people that have played this one thing for a long time and might think, oh, it could be this interesting new option, or no, I don't really like that. That's what I think. EyePatchNotes, thank you for your interesting and hopefully possible in the future idea. It would be interesting. I feel like Nightwave cred rewards also kind of need just a little something more. Like I feel like to be excited about them, I need just a little bit more, and so that it could be a pretty cool option. If they do 1 or 2 a Nightwave season, then we'll never really have too many because it will be like 3 years or 5 years or 10 years before there even is an Arcane helmet for every Warframe, which sounds like not too many at all. So we can hope.